Station. I am your host, Jeff Mayhew. I'm here with my No Cap crew, my No Cap Fund crew, Walter Clapp and Roger Scott. And today on the show, we have a very special guest, Dylan Pauman, fellow at the Acton Institute and an author of a new book, The Kingdom of God and the Common Good. Dylan, thank you for joining the station today.
It's great to be here.
Now, for those out there listening, Dylan is in Michigan, and I don't know if you have been paying attention to the news, but they had a big snowstorm. So his camera's off to try to conserve some internet usage and make the audio a little bit better. So just be aware of that for today. But otherwise, he's here and he's ready to explore our topics. So tonight we're going to talk about three things. We're going to talk about how we localize politics again. We're going to talk about power and the government's role, and we're going to talk about what reforming the government looks like. So, Dylan, we reached out to Dylan after reading an article for Law and Liberty that he wrote, talking about the scalability of democracy. And in there, he mentions that, you know, the old phrase that all politics is local, but it's kind of not. It's really national now. So we really wanted to have him on the show and talk about that because it's something that we care about here. If we're going to uncap the House, one of the things that I've talked about is like regular people have to do it. We have to come together in our communities and we have to ask the people in power to share power with us. And that means having a local voice in your national government. But it also means being engaged locally and localizing politics again. So with that, I'm going to lead with you, Dylan, since you wrote the article. What does localizing our politics mean? How do we do that?
I guess I have two answers to that question. One is my article is all about a very hypothetical proposal, which I kind of openly admit is a little utopian because unfortunately I don't know how practical it is. But I'll just start with let's just imagine that this is all going to work out. Here's how it would go down. So what I see as a problem, a lot of people talk about as a problem. I think people left and right, wherever you are, can agree that we have a problem with populism today, right? We have the internet, mob mentality, and that's bleeding into our politics. And really everything becomes national to the point where, somebody's running for drain commissioner and they ask them, what do you think about the war in Ukraine? Or, like that kind of, disconnect between, I want to know how you stand on some party issue that has nothing to do with what you're running for. And, actually having a clean water system or whatever you need. So I think part of the problem, and this is why I think it's such a hard sell, is that our structure of our democracy is really out of whack. And if you think of the way in which it was originally founded, of course, we all think there were some flaws. That's why we have many amendments, some amendments better than others. But slavery was a bad thing. We gave women the right to vote. I think that's a good thing. But we have some issues where the 17th Amendment, for example, got rid or established the direct election of senators. So now instead of your state Congress electing your senator, your representative to go to the Senate, your two of them, people got to vote on them. And people like to vote on things. People hate it when it doesn't just come down to majority rule. So think of how everybody views the electoral college, at least since 2000 when we had such a close race between Al Gore and George W. Bush, and really every 4 years since then, you kind of hear the same thing, that we got to get rid of it. This is so antiquated, it's undemocratic. But I actually think that sort of thing is what we need more of. So the very thing that everybody seems to agree is bad is what I think we need more of. And the reasoning goes like this. When you have, let's say, however many voters we have, 200 million potential voters, something like that, and there's, 250, that's a gigantic voting pool. And okay, it goes down to the states, but the population of Michigan, we're talking, 15, 20 million, something like that. Your one vote counts for less and less and less the larger the voting pool. Right. It's like the difference between like a 100-ticket raffle and playing the Powerball lottery. except that somebody actually wins the Powerball lottery, and I'm not sure any of us are winning in our politics today. What we need is to lower the scope of how many people are voting. But at the same time, of course, we have a giant country, and everybody does need to have a say in it. So how do you do that? Well, the founders had a plan. In fact, our Constitution still stipulates this, as I'm sure you guys are well aware, that there's supposed to be one representative for every 30,000 people in this country. And since the early 20th century, that has not been the case. I've heard conflicting stories. There was an actual bill passed, I believe, in 1918, or some kind of ordinance, that kind of thing, that capped the number of seats in the House of Representatives. But I've heard some people say it was just like the fire marshal said, we can't fit any more people in here. Some ridiculous, even unpolitical idea. But in any case, what that means now is even your representative, who's supposed to be your local district, you could be one of a million people in some cases. And that just means that your one vote means very little. I read a lot of public choice economics. When I work at the Acton Institute, we do a lot with the public choice tradition, Virginia, and as well as like the Austrian School of Economics. And, a lot of them are very skeptical of what one vote can get you and what you ought to vote for or care about. And this is part of the reasoning that at the end of the day, what does your vote really matter? Now, of course, the people who get elected because they got the most votes. So it does matter in some way. But I think there's this growing sense of powerlessness among voters that they vote and they're just a drop in the bucket, very literally. And technically, we're supposed to have this system where we have a say. And technically, we do have a say because we show up to the voting booths. In fact, more and more people in the past few years have been very politically active, civically active voting. But everything seems to be getting worse. So my proposal that I put forth in the essay, which this is one of those essays, sometimes I write an essay or an op-ed and I think this is crazy. Nobody's going to publish it. Law and Liberty was like, this is great. We're going to run it tomorrow. It was sort of thing. I was like, oh, okay. And then I was like, well, good thing no one will read it. And then people were emailing me like, hey, this is a great idea. Thanks for writing that. And I was meeting people at conferences. They're like, hey, you're the guy that wrote that weird essay, about the scaling democracy. And so my thought is in my current little district of Kent County, there's about 30,000 people that elect the county commissioner. There we go. Just like the founders intended. I think we should all have our own little county commissioners or some equivalent electorate, delegate, something like that. You elect those people in your locality where you have the local knowledge that no central government bureaucrat can have. Where the representative, because there's so few of you, can actually take the time to get to know you. You write them a letter, they're going to read it because they actually really want your vote. They can't just say, oh, that's just one vote. Who cares? The median voter is really hard to just aggregate. You have to actually pay attention to every interest within that small of a group of people. And so you elect that person and then they elect the next level up. So maybe that's you have different districts in your county. They elect your one county person or whatever. That people, they elect your state representatives and so on and so forth. And what this would do is it would push local issues upward. So if the person on the next level up wanted to get reelected, they have to pay a lot of attention to every single county commissioner electorate person. And all of their constituents who they're representing, and so on. Instead, what we have is everybody gets to vote on everything right now, and that pushes national issues downward. I think it's affected our media. Almost the only thing you hear about on the news today are national or international issues even. And it's not that those things aren't important, of course, but we all have our communities. We all have our own differences, our own uniqueness, and I think one of the brilliant aspects of the design of our Constitution is federalism. And within that federalism, there was always this understanding of, cities and towns and counties having their own sovereignty. And I just think we've been losing that more and more and more. And it's not just a matter of, people spending too much time on their phones, although that might not help. But there's actually something structurally involved that you have to actually set the rules of the game, the parameters of institutions, and that's going to constrain human behavior. and it's either going to shape it in a positive way or in a negative way. And I think we've had these reforms, at least starting with the 17th Amendment, and then just kind of general attitudes and whatnot that have really pushed things in the wrong direction. Now, how do we go about changing that? I'm not really sure. Other than to say, maybe pay a bit more attention to those local elections, right? If we could just flip the turnout numbers right now, more than half of America shows up for national elections. But every state election and then, the off year election, those are far less, attended as far as participation. Fewer voters or percent as a percentage of population participate in those. We need to flip it around, right? We need to have that greater local interest. But again, there's just so much working against that. So even the national year elections, they have local ordinances, they have state proposals to amend the Constitution. Another thing I think is terrible and unconstitutional, or at least not according to the design, right? It should not just be a will of the majority to amend a Constitution. That's why we have representatives. But in a lot of states, Michigan is one of them, you can just check a box for straight ticket voting. We took it away for about 10 years and then we brought it back, which I think is too bad. So a lot of people, they say, I like Donald Trump or I like Kamala Harris or, whoever. And then they don't really pay attention to anything else because nobody's actually telling them about anything else. And they show up and they get their ballot and there's 10 other names and a few different proposals and some judges. And they just check the box for Republican or Democrat and then they turn it in. And that's it. So I think we have to reconsider really every step of the process, and then figure out, okay, maybe the opportunity is because people aren't paying attention to those local elections, civically minded people who see this problem, who get it, need to start running for those offices, get elected for those offices, and then see what power you have in that position to shape things in a better direction. But that's going to differ depending on the context.
All right, so there's a lot there. A very interesting concept. I've thought about this a little bit. I'm not 100% sure how it's basically like it's in a hierarchy, like it's a step ladder of like elections that you're talking about. But I'm gonna get Walter in here. Walter,
Yeah.
What's your thoughts about this idea? Obviously, it's kind of like in the realm of what we're talking about of like we need to make politics smaller, we need to make the districts smaller, but it's obviously a very different election process than what we're talking about.
I actually have a lot of thoughts because, well, for a couple reasons. One of which is after I read the book Scale by Geoffrey West, I wrote a paper about essentially this thing to replace the UN, right? To try to get us to some sort of global consensus from the ground up, and it essentially worked exactly the way that Dylan is proposing. And what I've learned over time, well, first they rejected the paper, so I was not as lucky as Dylan. But the other thing that I've realized is that the caucus system actually demonstrates essentially what Dylan is proposing. It just kind of stops at a certain level, and it tends to be party based. But when I participated in the Wyoming State GOP convention in 2024, that's kind of the way it started. You meet in your district and you elect somebody, and that person goes to the next stage and gets together, and if they want to go to the next stage, they kind of lobby or kind of work on getting themselves elected to the next stage. And there's about 3 stages to get to the state election, and then you can get yourself elected to the federal convention. But I like the idea, and I think that it is theoretically possible. It would be great to see it implemented in a business, right? Like a large national business, I think would be a great place to see it tested, or in a like the crypto markets, because it is kind of one of the reasons I turned from something like this that is more of a departure from our historical structure is because it just didn't seem like it was something that was going to get adopted without some serious testing. And I don't run ExxonMobil, so I wasn't going to be able to implement it at Exxon. So that's those are kind of my thoughts. I think it would be great if we could kind of like wave our wand and have more bottom up sort of caucus based scalable representation. And I think one of the beauties of it is it lets the people that want to be involved get involved, and it lets the people who don't want to be involved not be involved. And it also kind of creates this direct chain of command, right? Like if I wanted to get a message to my federal representative, it's like I know at whatever level I am, like I know the direct chain of command to that person, essentially. So I think there's some advantages to it. I think the disadvantage is that it's a departure from what we have now, and so we need to, I think, prove it up first.
Roger, what's your thoughts?
Hold on. Okay, so as I listened to it, it sounded. It's not exactly the correct analogy, but it sounds like moving back toward closer to a direct democracy, right? Your 30,000 people meet in the town square and raise their hand. They don't do that, of course, but it's just that. The difference, of course, is they're only deciding local issues themselves, and then they elect one person to go off and do the next thing. I'm having a hard time warming up to it. I have other ideas about how we make politics and smaller, more local, that sort of thing. I'm having trouble trying to figure out how we could, the mechanics of trying to move from what we have now down to that. I shouldn't say down to that. From what we have now to that strikes me as a gargantuan challenge without necessarily, I don't see the benefit, I guess. The cost benefit ratio isn't there for me.
So
is what it boils down to.
So I have a question for
Okay.
Dylan. What the
Yeah.
how do you perceive the elections happening? Right? Like, so if you're electing your county commissioner, then your county commissioner is electing the next person up, right? And then so forth. So you really have no more like campaigning. Like you don't need to you're the only person that's running for office, like directly for the people at that point is like that lowest level county commissioner. Am I understanding this correctly, or what am I missing here?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the idea is they could literally knock on everyone's door and have a conversation with them if they had that small of a constituency.
Yeah, but the next person up is no longer campaigning. They're getting basically elected by the person below them.
They need to.
They campaign for their voters, which
They
is
need to
not the
campaign
people.
among the representatives. Yeah.
Yes.
Among the representatives,
not the
but
people.
not
So it's the
not the people.
opposite of direct democracy. To Roger's point, I look at it as very
Right.
indirect democracy. So, direct democracy is what we currently have, which is everybody gets to vote. Well, not totally, but kind of
Yeah.
what we currently have.
It's all
Everybody gets to
messy.
vote on president, for example. Whereas I'm very skeptical about direct democracy. See the Great Terror and other failed experiments. But I think actually I like Walter's point, and this is actually something that years ago I was a bit more skeptical about public choice because these really smart people, and they write these great papers, and sometimes there's this really deep game theory involved, and there's numbers and charts and all this sort of thing. And I took a step back at one point. I was like, when is this ever going to happen? When do they think that anybody's ever going to use any of this, right? And because I was specifically thinking about government, and our system does change slowly, generally, and to make that kind of big of a change, you tend to have to go through so many barriers that it does make me pretty pessimistic. But you can try to demonstrate a proof of concept elsewhere. So one thing I did mention in my article is that, of course, there are other countries in the world who do things differently. So, a parliamentary system, the people elect the representative, the party that wins the most seats or the winning coalition, they then choose the prime minister, not the people, right? So there are precedents in the world of this sort of thing happening, although I don't think those systems are all necessarily, better than ours. But the mechanics are there, at least in that degree. But you can also do things like, whether it's the corporate world, although there are reasons why you probably shouldn't have everybody voting on stuff, even in the corporate world. I think it's right now even less democratic than what I'm proposing, and there are reasons for that. But another one I thought of is there's church politics. So religious institutions. Again, I work at the Acton Institute. We focus on faith and economics. That's all of our research is focused on that. And all my degrees are in theology, so I'm always thinking about churches and religion. And parishes and even whole church structures have changed throughout the centuries. In ancient Rome, people actually voted on their bishops. So there's all kinds of negative with like the emperor becoming Christian, but one thing he did was he made the bishops civil servants, and so now suddenly the people were voting on at least one of their civil servants, right? The bishop. There's just all sorts of things like that maybe there's voluntary associations. They usually have, if they're big enough anyway, they have some kind of bylaws, some kind of structure for how are we going to conduct ourselves at our meetings, how are we going to structure things. If they get large enough over a larger region, do we have local chapters in a region and a national group, and you could experiment with different structures in those sorts of settings. And maybe you can make an argument from that to some degree that, hey, look, this is working so well in industry X or whatever. Is there some way we could start incorporating this? Again, probably starting at the most local level, because it'd be the easiest to win the seats you would need to start affecting some change, and then hopefully work its way up. That was usually one of the strengths of federalism that people talk about, is that you have, these 50 laboratories of democracy, and it's supposed to be, well, once something works really well, then maybe we can talk about doing it on the federal level. And we have too much going the other way these days. So again, I don't know quite how to change the whole momentum of, people's over focus on Washington. But I do think like the mechanisms are there. You can build a better mousetrap. It's just whether or not people will let you do it.
And to that point, I found the biggest flaw in your system. If you're not going to have constant campaigns,
sure,
then you've disrupted one of the
Money.
biggest economies in the world. And as Mark Hanna would say, the most important thing in politics is money, and I can't remember the second most important thing. Something, a paraphrase like that. And I think, ultimately, if you gotta have campaigns. And I think the other part is like, especially when you get to middle to lower class, blue collar voters, they're very skeptical of power. And I consider myself in that group and my family in that group. I grew up in that group. They're very skeptical of those in power. And so while they would enjoy a smaller subset to be able to actually meet the person in power and vote for that person, I don't know how well they would like the fact that they lose the power to elect everybody above them at some point. It's like now it's out of your hands.
Right.
So I see benefits because you can still go back to that person.
You don't lose your power if you work hard to get yourself elected. I think is
but only
Yeah,
only you'd have a lot of people elected, but I get what you're saying. Not everybody wants to be in government or be in a representative either.
Absolutely. So I mean that's part of the paradox. I talk about it as a utopian proposal, and the word utopia comes from Greek, and it's actually a play on words. Actually, it was invented by Thomas More, so I guess it's English, but he's drawing from Greek. And in Greek, you can have utopos, which means no place, as in this place, this would never exist, right? That's usually how people use the term utopia, or utopia, EU, as in a good place. So it's this good place that doesn't exist, right, or can't exist. And that's kind of how I look at it. Is that I think it's a really good design. I think practically it would even work. The problem is practically convincing people to give it a try, and then the implementation of it. But I don't think the flaw is so much on the mechanics. I think it's more rhetoric. I think there's just a mountain in the way of people saying, "Are you telling me you don't want me to be able to vote for president or senator or governor?" And my answer is yes, right? But the reason is I want their vote to have more power. And the fewer voters there are, the more power one vote has.
Yeah, it seems like a heavier lift even than getting people to agree to uncap the House.
One step at a time. One step at a time. See, but here's the thing. I think uncapping the House would be closer to, once you get people to agree to that or understand the importance of that, they're more likely to understand or agree to Dylan's proposal. So like everything is, it's baby steps. It's little bites at the apple. You have to move people in the right direction. And understanding that I think this is the key. Smaller groups are almost always better for the individual because, like Dylan said, you have more power now that there are less people involved in your group. Now, as a nation, we are one large group, and that keeps us safe from other large groups. But we want to retain our freedom and our independence, and that means creating a political structure that has smaller groups. And I think obviously our big thing is uncapping the House. Dylan wants to make it even smaller, which I don't disagree with in theory. I just a little bit less practical, I think.
But I'm not sure what you mean by smaller, because if he's suggesting that we get a representative from every county, I mean, that would be a much bigger House.
Well, it would be a bigger House, but a smaller group. A smaller group that you're a part of for voting for that person.
Right. It would be tiered. So there, you can actually maybe even keep 435 seats. Although I'm definitely with you guys on this uncap it and go back to what the Constitution says. If in between you have this tiered system where the counties are voting for, whatever the regions of the state, and they're voting for the state, and then they're voting for, the Midwest, and then all the way to the federal side or something like that. And, you have to, of course, have some kind of proportional way of doing this based on population and whatnot. But if you have more steps along the way, right, more tiers, then the final number at the federal Congress might end up being the same. But in between, I think, Jeff started by talking about almost a kind of ladder system to it. And if you think of it more in that way, we've cut out all the steps on the ladder. And I'm saying that we need to restore them. That's the only way you can climb the ladder, really. That's the only way your vote is and your interests are gonna get to the national stage, if necessary, is if we reduce the voting pool, not by telling people they can't vote, but just by limiting which offices we can vote on, and then tiering the system up that way.
All right. Okay, so let's move on to segment two.
I totally agree. This is a hard sell. Go ahead. Yeah.
All right. So we're gonna think about this, and I think it's worth thinking about. But let's move on to segment two. So as we're talking about government, and we're talking about the people's power, and having a smaller group gives that individual more power, but then they're vesting that power into the government, and so I think citizens should understand or have a concept of what is the government's role and what is their power. And I came up with this based on recent comments by Stephen Miller to Jake Tapper when he was talking about, Greenland and Venezuela. And he says, we live in a world, in the real world, that is governed by strength, that is governed by force, that is governed by power. These are the iron laws of the world. He says, we're a superpower, and President Trump and we are going to conduct ourselves as a superpower. Now, does having power mean that you have unilateral ability to use that power, and you should use that power for whatever interest you seem fit? or is power more of a responsibility that you have to conduct yourselves within, the sphere of other people and other nations in a civil and, respectable manner? What are your guys' thoughts? Let's start with Roger, because I think I went Dylan first and then Walter. So let's go with Roger first.
Well, Stephen Miller has got all kinds of psychosis going on in his head. We're a superpower, and we've demonstrated our strength for what now, 80 years since the founding of NATO. There's been skirmishes, this and that and the other, but it's all been held together for 80 years, mostly by America. Why do we need to change our behavior now? I don't buy it. I think Stephen Miller is dead wrong and also an idiot.
I contend that Stephen Miller is a very, very smart, yet not greatest person. He's a very smart man, though. And you can't underestimate his intelligence, because that puts you in a bad position.
You're right. He's not an idiot, but he's I don't know, man. The guy's twisted somehow.
Well, I think he has some sort of Napoleon complex. Maybe like, what is the Napoleon complex? Not being short, but being bald. Is there like a word for that? Because I think maybe he has that. But I don't know.
Both.
Walter, what do you think? Oh, sorry, Roger.
No, that's fine. He's dead wrong. That's all.
I saw a clip of one of his professors when he was an undergrad at Duke, and the professor alleged that that he asked Stephen Miller, "What do you want to do when you grow up?" And he said, "Well, I want to be number 2 in the White House." And he said, "Oh yeah, who's going to be president?" And he looked at him and he's like, maybe Trump. And so I would agree that I think that he definitely is smart. He's definitely smart. Rephrase the rest of your question, Jeff.
I guess that's okay. What's the role of government? With power? How should they is power something that the people in charge should wield unilaterally based on whatever they see fit in their what they believe the interest of the nation is, or is it something bigger? Is it more of a responsibility that they need to conduct themselves with prudence and civility?
So, I think they need to do whatever, or they will do whatever they're allowed to get away with. And I think in a representative democracy, they're meant to represent the interests of the people and the organizations and collaborations of people amongst the nation who tell them what the bounds are. And so, I think principally, structurally, our founders intended for that power to be divided amongst 3 branches of government horizontally, and then also as between the federal government, the states, and the counties vertically. And so, there are structural limits, and I think one of the questions is whether or not the people will demand that the people, those who do wield power, who hold power, abide by those structures. And what can the people do if things get out of whack? Well, they can demand that we kind of realign the structures. And I think as we all agree, principally we need more legislators because the legislative branch has become increasingly weak, and so the executive branch is wielding too much power and is not checked by the judiciary because of all the executive powers that are kind of necessarily exigent in circumstance. And so you need a legislature with the power of the purse and the power to impeach in order to wield a really big stick to curtail those powers of the executive.
Dylan, what are your thoughts?
So I work at the Acton Institute. We're named for the British historian Lord John Acton, who said power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. there is some truth to the idea that we are a superpower. I saw somebody post today and said, he's just saying what everyone else has been doing. He's just being more honest about it. Look at U.S. foreign policy over however many years and whatnot. If that's the case, I don't think it makes it any better of a statement. I think he's wrong. He's wrong for a variety of reasons, but I think most fundamentally there's an anthropological problem, or maybe even a cosmological problem. He said these are the iron laws of the universe, right? Just basically might makes right. For a long time, and really many people in the present, don't believe that those are the iron laws of the universe. They believed in something called natural law. This is the idea that written into your very being as a human being, you have some sense of right and wrong. You have a conscience, and you have the faculty of reason, which can help you explore these questions and understand them better. This was so crucial that John Locke, who is someone often criticized and rarely read these days, just like Adam Smith, he said that he called it a state of nature, and he didn't mean it like Hobbes. He didn't mean nasty, brutish, and short. He thought there was organization in society, and the rules for that society were the natural law. And it looked basically like kind of 10 Commandments sort of stuff. Do not steal, do not murder, do not lie, right? Those things that we all intuitively know. And he even addresses the challenge within his 2 treatises on government. He says, well, where does this state of nature ever exist? And he says, well, it exists in international relations. That's where it exists. Between nations that don't share a polity, that don't share laws, there are still cosmic laws, moral laws, natural laws that bound their behavior. And so if you look at what he says about that state of nature, he talks about how everyone, in a sense, was able to be judge over the actions of another, an executor of that natural law. He, at least by implication, would think that goes on the international stage. So I think when someone goes around saying we're just going to do whatever we want because we got nukes, there's a responsibility and even a sanction in a positive sense for other nations to put their foot down and say we're not going to let you do that. Right. That's an actual violation of whether it's the sovereignty of Greenland or, pick your issue. That's the most recent one. That's what Miller was talking about. It's entirely not just permissible, but there's even a duty for other nations to come together and, unfortunately, in this case, stand against the United States foreign policy. I wish that were not the case. But that's my take on it. You cannot just let absolute power come down to one person or group of people. It necessarily corrupts, as Acton said. That's as Walter so fittingly put it. That's why we have this whole system of checks and balances and division of power in our Constitution. And ideally, we would have that on the international stage as well. And I have plenty of criticisms for whether it be the European Union, the UN, NATO, whatever. But we do need something like that. Even the European Union, whatever your criticisms may be. France and Germany haven't gone to war with each other in a while, so I think they're actually doing an okay job, right? Everything else aside, I think their economic policy is problematic in some ways, but that's the reason why they exist, and they're succeeding at that. And so when you have someone making these statements with the ear of the leader of the free world, which is a superpower, is the most powerful country in the world. Maybe one other nation is not a superpower, but plenty of them together can put up a really good front. So, unfortunately, I'm rooting for American principles because I think they're in American interest, and I think our current American foreign policy is actually not in our interest, despite what Stephen Miller may say.
Yeah. So I read Ben Shapiro's book Lions and Scavengers recently. And in his book, he defines the lions as the builders, the people that see power as a responsibility and believe in something more than just power, more than just ourselves in, maybe a supreme being or maybe natural law, as you described. And he described scavengers as the conspiracy theorist, the victims and they believe that power exists solely, and that, I'll read this from the book. There is no master plan behind the universe. The world is a purposeless place, and all morals and civilizations are merely guises for power. He goes on, all systems that we see are therefore the products of winners who have exerted their power over losers. There are no moral systems, just power systems. There is no truth, merely power. There is no knowledge, merely power. In the view of the scavengers, we swim in a sea of power, expressing itself in a variety of forms and fashions. Our perception of reality itself is merely a reflection of power dynamics. And I mean, I feel like he's very much describing Stephen Miller's comments here, although he wrote that book, way before Stephen Miller. And I think, I very much agree with what Shapiro is writing. But there is this blind spot that people in the media, specifically conservatives, have had over the last, since Donald Trump has entered office. They seem not to apply these theories to the people on their side. They'll go after the Democrats or the liberals on stuff like this, but they very rarely go after, their own side. Even in the book, he talks about how the Lions are taking control again because Donald Trump got reelected. Yet it's almost impossible to read the book and the way that he describes the scavenger and not think of Donald Trump as a scavenger and not a lion, because he uses all of the scavenger's tricks to gain power. It is conspiracy theories and victimization. And when you hear his number two, as I don't think he's actually number two in the White House, but he might be number two in the White House, Stephen Miller.
He's the deputy chief of staff.
Okay. He sees the world as a system of power, and he thinks that, this is what you do with power. You wield power however you see fit with your interest. And, I don't see it that way. I think I'm a firm believer that power is a responsibility. And I think Dylan, as you kind of mentioned, is, yes, we are the biggest superpower, but a whole bunch of little powers could, join together, and then all of a sudden we're not so big anymore. Right. And I think that's the concept that, if you're going to have power, you have to share it. If you share it, it won't corrupt you as much. Well, Roger, you want to get in here?
Yeah. All they have to do is choose not to renew their investments in about 15% of their holdings of U.S. treasuries. And the U.S. government will snap to pretty quick. 15 to 20%, just say, we're not going to buy them. The interest rates are going to rise. The Treasury will be running around the world trying to find somebody to buy bonds. They'll have to raise their rates. That's how America's going to be brought to heel, is through economics, through markets. People are going to withhold the investments until the interest rates become exorbitant.
Maybe. People are, you see this in the market. You see boycotts and stuff like that. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. You've got to get a whole bunch of individuals to make the same effort at the same time and be willing to sacrifice on their own, because there's money for them to lose in situations like this too.
Yeah, well, we're a debtor nation, right? we are, we claim to be a superpower, and we are, but we have a really, really serious Achilles heel that would be easy for people to use against us. Yes, they would give up some money, but you know what? They can invest in bonds elsewhere. And when the money's going into those markets, it's going to cause those rates to go up a little bit, so that they're not going to lose that much. The Chinese hold big numbers too. The Chinese and the Europeans have big holdings of U.S. treasuries.
So, all right. So we're talking about Stephen Miller's comments. We're talking about the government's responsibility and power. Let's talk about how do we check that? And Walter already brought it up. We have a representative system of government. Why isn't, or why won't, Congress check the president's power? They have the power of the purse, as Walter mentions it a lot. They have the power of impeachment. And I think, I'm sorry, but going to the president, or was it Denmark? And he said, because you didn't give me the Nobel Peace Prize, this is part of the reason I'm coming after Greenland. Like, I know those weren't his exact words, but just how ridiculous is that? It's just an embarrassment, yes. And I'm not saying
Today's
that President J.D. Vance would be any better than President Donald Trump, but can it get any worse than what it is right now? Why doesn't Congress exert their power? Dylan, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think, I don't want to rehash the whole first segment here, but, too many of them are dependent upon, people who vote based on national issues. And Donald Trump has a giant fan club. They raise a ton of money all across the country, even if they're running for some tiny district in, Wyoming or something like that, because they hitch their, wagon to him. And I just don't think they have the backbone. I mean, you also have the problem of, and this is true of any reform anywhere, it is very hard for people in politics to implement the reforms that are needed when those same reforms would be democratically unpopular, right? When you know that the right thing to do means you not having a job after the next election, people buckle. I mean, this is why, I'm pro-democracy, but I'm not pro-direct democracy. I think we need a lot of checks on how it works. The other way, and we already mentioned a little bit, is the other countries, of course, can have a check. I mean, that's what the UN is supposed to do. I don't think they're very effective at it, but there's supposed to be a check on rogue nations doing terrible things in the world. That's what NATO is, right? It's supposed to be a check on Russia, and we can argue about how effective it's been since the fall of the Soviet Union, but that's the idea there. But yeah, I think people do get tired of this. Like, it is ridiculous. Like you said, it's embarrassing. I think, my theory of who's going to win the next election is always just who's more fun. So the exception being in 2020, I don't think Trump was more fun or wasn't more fun than Biden, because Biden's not interesting. But Trump was just so unfun at the time during the pandemic, so ineffectual, not really doing anything, like leaving it to everybody below him, that people just were fed up with it. So I do think people can get fed up, but the problem is who else is going to come along? I think JD Vance would be as bad or worse than Trump. I think amazingly, things can always get worse. Not to say that I want to just keep things how they are, but it's not enough just to overthrow the current order because it's bad. You have to have a plan for how to make it better. And I think most revolutions in history, with the exception of the American Revolution, demonstrate that. People tear it all down and they have no good plan for how to make it work. And so what happens? Well, at best, you get like the military in charge of the entire polity, because at least that's a structure that was still preserved through it all. There has to be people making the plans. And I mean, that's why, utopian thought experiments are actually important. John Locke wrote his 2 treatises and he was arguing with Robert Filmer. And at the time, it didn't matter, right? But eventually it did, indirectly, influentially. And I think it's important to have these conversations like we're having now, to put it on paper, to put it in books, to try to convince people at dinner parties, even though they'll think you're crazy. I mean, don't be annoying about it, but it's important to keep that conversation going, so that people aren't left without a plan. There will come a time after Donald Trump. Is that time going to be better or worse? Well, I hope we have a plan.
Well, you ask why Congress won't do its job. And part of it, inertia is not exactly the right word, but they've let it play out for so long now that if they stand up, they will get roasted one way or the other, whether it's elections or whatever. I remember there was, after the 2020 election, when Trump was going on about, he won the election, some elected Republican somewhere, I can't remember who, was on camera saying, what's the harm in letting it play out for a little while? All right? This is the harm. We're living the harm right now because an elected GOP Congress wouldn't tell him to sit down and shut up when they should have told him to sit down and shut up. That's it.
Walter, any final thoughts before we move to segment 3?
Well, Machiavelli, I guess, is an important thought experiment here, right? On the
Very wise man.
scavenger theory of power. And I think importantly, most of our founders had read Machiavelli. They understood this idea of realpolitik. Might makes right, dirty tricks, and I'm going to lay a lot of the blame here with I'll call it a blob, an amorphous kind of conglomeration of interests, of corporate and governmental interests that coincided and has wielded power around the world, but also domestically, who basically bungled things. I mean, they really screwed things up in basically making it seem like we're continuing to have a democratic republic, and all these great institutions, and then the facade came off during Trump won, and I'll say the Russia hoax, which I think you gotta acknowledge that, COVID, and then a series of bungles, with the social media landscape. And so, why does Trump wield so much power over these representatives? Well, it's a constellation of factors, including the 1929 Permanent Apportionment Act. And basically, I think Machiavelli has been there in the background the whole time, consolidating power amongst people who, frankly, don't have a good fear of God, would be my kind of the way I boil it down. And if to the extent that Trump doesn't think he's going to make it into heaven, that's the problem, right? It's that he doesn't fear something supernatural outside of himself that can provide him justice when he passes, from this corporal existence into the next one. And I think that the natural law theory is closer to something that's right. The golden rule kind of has migrated from the Bible, and it's important to realize that when you lie to people, when you lie to other countries, when you abuse your power, it will come back and bite us in the butt. And I think there's no doubt about that. And I think we're continuing to see the ramifications of our escapades in South America kind of on those grounds. Overthrowing this person or that person because we don't think that the people can get it right. And in a lot of ways, Trump was a reaction to this. Trump was a reaction to the elites not thinking that the people knew what was best for them. But then, kind of ironically, he's running with the ball. He and his team, I think, especially the folks over at Heritage, very much think that. I mean, they're very monarchical. They think that the people don't know what's best for them, and so we sure as heck shouldn't uncap the house. I think many of them would say, and time will tell. And I think, for me personally, my solace is knowing that there is a supernatural power that will judge these people who make the wrong choices while they're here on Earth. So,
All right, so we're gonna move to segment 3.
Very well said.
I want to push back on just one little thing you said there, although we don't have time to litigate it right now. I wouldn't call it a Russia hoax. I think that the Democrats oversold what they were trying to do with the impeachment. But if you sit down, you read the Mueller report, what you'll find it's a very intricate investigation that was stonewalled, and they broke rules that, while maybe not written or legal, they broke ethics that were not broken before. Giving internal polling data through Paul Manafort to the Russians, I don't think was necessarily in the best interest of America, and that allowed Russia to use their influence in social media to pump ads.
The Steele dossier is a fraud, in a lie that bit and will continue to bite the Democratic Party in the butt for as long as people remember.
That doesn't take away from the other things that were done wrong, though. Like, I'm not going to dispute
it
that with
does.
you.
That's my point. It clouds the entire thing. When you whole cloth fabricate a story that is clearly fake, and you're using former intelligence assets, you sully the whole cloth, right? You don't get to piss on the bed and say, oh, this corner over here is still clean. You can just sleep over there. It's like, no, the whole thing's ruined. And I'm sorry, but like the same thing is true, I think, of like the CDC today, right? So you look at the CDC. Who trusts the CDC today? Well, nobody, right? Not the right, not the left.
I trust
You
them.
do?
Sure.
So you approve of the new? Never mind. I don't want to get too far down a tangent. Go ahead, Jeff.
All right. What I would say is that's politics, and that happens over and over and over and over again in history, and it will continue to happen. And you can't throw everything out because politics happens. So, anyways,
I think I
segment
should
3.
clarify. I don't trust RFK Jr. or anybody that he's appointed. The CDC existed for a long time. No, there's a long history of good scientific information in the CDC's records. I trust the CDC as an institution. I don't trust the people who are currently trying to remake it into something else. There's plenty of good information in their records.
So you like Pfizer's version of the CDC?
All right.
I'm not sure what you mean, but we can move on to the next segment.
All right. So we can all agree on this. The government has some issues. People don't trust the institutions the way that they should trust the institutions. And I think all of us here, and if I'm speaking out of turn, please correct me, believe that that is a structural issue, which means we need government reform. So my question, and I'll let Dylan lead off on this one, or actually, Walter, I don't think I've let you lead off. I'll let you lead off on this one. No, I'm sorry, because I already know what your answer is. I'm going to get Dylan's first. Sorry. Sorry. It's uncap the house, right? So Dylan, what does government reform look like? How do we reform the government? Where do we go from here? How do we make this happen?
Oh, that's such a good question. I mean, a lot of my work, Acton is unique for a think tank. We're educational. We don't do white papers. We're not trying to affect policy, and we're actually very purposefully not in Washington, D.C. And I think, that's part of the solution. It needs to be on a more local level, but also we need to tap into things that are broader than politics. If the problem is everything's getting politicized, what's needed is not another political argument. We need to realize that there are things prior to politics that affect things. I think Walter very eloquently talked about the importance of having some belief in God or a higher power. And just to be clear, like, I have friends who are atheists. I'm not trying to say they're all necessarily bad people or anything like that. In fact, the whole idea of natural law is that you have some understanding of right and wrong. But I'll put it this way. Your view of how the universe works, this goes back to Stephen Miller's point, I suppose, will affect what you expect out of government and what you want out of government and what you think you need from government. So the Puritans, known for, kind of very strict internal governments of their communities and whatnot, Alexis de Tocqueville came to America, and he was really impressed with them because he said, yeah, they got all these laws, but nobody ever uses them, right? They have these mores in their community, and that doesn't matter. And in fact, a lot of their community was very free in the sense of, they need to build a barn. They got people together and they built the barn. And it wasn't like, oh, we have to first have a commission and then we have to, yada, 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 all that kind of stuff. And I think that actually came down to the fact that they were Calvinists. I'm not myself a Calvinist, but I've studied their theology. And they have a very strong belief in providence, in the sovereignty of God. And that's, of course, true of most religious traditions in some degree, but they're like, up to 11, right? They're the spinal tap of providence. And when you have that view that, okay, God is taking care of the universe, and we have some responsibilities within our communities, but ultimately God is in charge, then you don't have to do everything. Then the government doesn't have to do everything, right? The rain will fall, right? The spring will come again, and no human being is responsible for that. It happens because there's an order to things. And, you see that written into the Declaration of Independence. You see that, there all sorts of different beliefs. Some were deists, some were Masons, some were Christians among the founding fathers, but they all had some kind of belief in providence, wherever they were coming from. And I think that's missing. I think we actually need to talk more, as if this is a solution, right? I guess this is where I come to. My solution for we're talking too much about politics and getting it wrong is we need to talk about religion more, which that hasn't gone very well historically. But I do think we have to get at those deeper convictions. We have to actually address people in our lives for who they are. And we have to find, the term is, the third spaces, right? And I actually do. Most churches, unfortunately, are divided politically, denominations and whatnot. But I belong to a very big church, the Greek Orthodox Church. And I love that at coffee hour, we have people who I know are card-carrying Republicans and Democrats, and they're just eating hummus and carrots and chatting about anything, even politics, because they have something bigger that unites them. And I think we've lost that in a lot of ways. And, that's hardly a easy, quick fix solution. But I do think caring more about politics is part of the solution to fixing our politics. That it's got to start on that level, or people aren't going to hear, hey, I have this new idea for how we can reform things. Because all they're caring about is how do I get my tribe, my side to win.
All right, Walter, I'll let you go now.
Well, I'm going to surprise you. So this conversation with Dylan has been thought-provoking for me, and so I've been studying the Greek Orthodox and the Eastern Church for a better part of a year and a half now, and I find it fascinating. I was watching kind of with bated breath as the Patriarch Bartholomew met with the new Roman Pope last November in Turkey. And I think, it strikes me that what Dylan was talking about earlier, his piece about scalable democracy and potentially applying it within the church, that would be fascinating to me, Dylan, if the Greek Orthodox community, instead of having another council, right? Just, quote unquote council of the patriarchs, if instead they, played a modern card from your book and were to, try to scale some sort of, representative, truly kind of, representing the body of Christ through the people, through kind of a bottom-up election, to get a new council to drive forward a reunification of the Eastern and Western Church, maybe that would drive us, to kind of see what you were talking about. That, at the end of the day, God is going to take care of it, and then also maybe then they would think about how important uncapping the house is, and so we might get there also. So. I'll
right. That's the real answer.
Well, I'll go now. Dylan, you may now count me among your atheist friends that you referred to earlier. And my
great. I'm glad to be a friend.
Yeah, and I'm friends with all reasonable people. Right? When you become unreasonable. Anyway, I won't go there. The idea of morality rooted in a religion, in Christianity or any other, my view is, these things, all these monotheistic religions, for that matter, all religions, are myths that were invented by people. So to the extent that there's morality and virtue in the Bible and in the Christian tradition, that all came from the mind of humans at some point in the past. I don't see the need for I don't feel that there's a morality imposed by a higher power, because I don't believe the higher power was created by human mind. So whatever morality and whatever virtue there is in that monotheistic tradition, it came from the mind of people in the first place. That's my position. And as far as what does reform look like, we'll know what reform looks like after we uncap the House, right? Because my position, stated many times, these guys have heard it before, is whatever particular governmental reform you support, your chances of success improve when we uncap the House and marginalize the extremists. All right? So unless your hope for reform is an extreme reform, you should have more success when we uncap the House. So what it looks like will become clear after we uncap the House.
All right, so here's what I think reform looks like. Reform looks like this. It looks like people with different points of views coming together and talking about difficult things. And, uncapping the House is a reform, right? Having these conversations are instrumental in having reform, but it can't just be, four guys from, four different parts of the country coming together on, an X live stream. It's got to be, 15, 20 people together in their communities, having talks about what they want to see their country look like for the next 15 to 20 to 35 years. And then it's kind of like the way Dylan described his ideal utopia is there's a ladder, like in America, the great thing about America, and they illustrated this in the show, The Gilded Age, really well. I wish I could remember the quote, but I wasn't prepared for it. I couldn't find it in my notes. But basically, like in America, anybody can become anybody, right? And there's a ladder that you can take to success, or you can jump the ladder sometimes too. And I think for a really long period of time, we had a ladder, and now it's gone, or at least there's not enough rungs on that ladder, and it's really hard for us to climb it, I think would be a better analogy. And so what does success look like? What does reform look like? It looks like consistency. It looks like conversation. It looks like emailing your representative and asking them to support uncapping the House by the 2030 census so we can expand it afterwards. It's a little ding. It's not being loud. It's being consistent. It's like that little chirp in your fire alarm, right? Like it's not really loud, but it is annoying. It only comes on every 3-4 minutes, but man, you want to get rid of it as soon as possible. That's what you need to become to your congressional representative. Because if you make your voice heard, if you make it consistent, if you get your friends to make your voice heard and you make them be consistent, then they will hear us. They will get annoyed by it, and they will understand the importance of expanding the House and uncapping it. So for me, that's what reform looks like. It's talking. It's, getting people together and moving forward in a purposeful direction. Any thoughts?
Yes, I've decided this year. You all know I'm a self-described curmudgeon and introvert, and all that's true. I do like sitting in the dark and writing code or solving accounting puzzles. But I'm going to have to get out of my house and go out and meet people more this year, not just for Uncap the House, but for other purposes. I'm a member of a professional networking group. I didn't go to a single meeting last year. Now that I think about it, that's kind of a problem. So I'm going to be doing more of that. And you've heard me refer to this local party, the Down Home, North Carolina party, right? They operate in about 10 counties here in the Piedmont. It's a small group, and it's a small group of people who are already politically motivated and to a more or less informed, right? So that's a good place to start. The things that we're putting together, you guys have already getting started. Mine's a little slower. I hope to get one going in February. I don't know how I'm going to promote it and find a group of people to come to it. I'll talk to what friends I have and say, hey, tell your friends. But I'm also going to go to the local, Democratic Party and probably the local Republican Party as well, and say this is the idea. This is our issue. This is what we're pushing forward. I'd appreciate any guidance you can give because I don't know what I'm doing, and none of us are political professionals, right? So to the extent they can give me guidance, or even better, a list of 10 people to contact who are most likely to come to the event. But I'm going to be doing more of that this year to get out and talk locally. So I'm definitely in agreement with Jeff on that.
And you brought up another great point about what does reform looks like. It looks like being in an uncomfortable situation. That's what I like. I started like 4 years ago or 5 years ago or whatever. I remember showing up to my first political event. I'm kind of like you. I don't like going to new places with new people. I find it, I don't know. I just find it very uncomfortable. I would prefer just to go with the same friends I have to the same place that I've always gone to. That's just the way that I am. And yeah, going into a Republican meeting, going into a Democratic meeting, I've knocked doors for both Republicans and Democrats. I've gone into all of those different uncomfortable rooms. Going to DC last week and visiting with my congressional representative, that was uncomfortable, right? But it was something that was necessary. And I think it's something that a lot of Americans don't do simply because it's uncomfortable. And, you know, if we're going to make change, if we're going to have reform, it means doing things that we don't necessarily want to do. And so I think that's a great point that you made there, Roger. Any final thoughts from the crew before we head out tonight?
The Aurora Borealis is going to be popping tonight. We've got a big solar storm. So if you live north of, I don't know, say Denver, let's see, you know, like north of Omaha,
The Mason-Dixon
a little bit
line.
north of Denver. Yeah, certainly I think, Dylan, you might be able to see it. You should see some nice, beautiful, colorful lights. It's a good reminder that our nation's electric grid is one of our greatest vulnerabilities, and we need a competent Congress to fix that problem. So, yeah, one more reason to think about uncapping the House. That's my final thought.
By the way, I saw a Democratic governor on one of the news shows on Saturday or Sunday saying almost the exact same thing, Walter. So this is becoming a bipartisan issue, so I think that's a good thing. Final thoughts from Dylan or Roger?
Yeah.
Dylan go
So,
ahead.
you know, you mentioned it looks like what we're doing. Oh, go ahead if you want to, Roger.
No. I was saying you're the guest.
Yeah,
You should
so-
go before me.
Okay. So Jeff, like you were saying, it looks like what we're doing here, it looks like having conversations in our communities, but also what you guys in particular are doing is it looks like building institutions, right? It's not enough to have a good idea. And, you know, so I wrote a book, right? My second book, Kingdom of God and the Common Good, putting in a plug for myself again. But if you look on the back, on my bio, not only does it say that I work at the ACT Institute, but it says I'm founder and president of a new institute, St. Nicholas Copposelos Institute. It's very new to the point where, you know, we have a website and that's about it. But I'm trying to found an institute because at best, you write a book about big ideas and I don't know, 500, 1,000 people buy it and maybe they talk about it for 6 months or a year, and then there's a new book, and it was a fad, and that's all it was. But if you build an institution, and if again and again you are engaging people, producing new things for them to interact with, that's where you can have long-term influence. And so I think institution building is a way of realizing that this has to be bigger than individuals and particular elections and whatever our time frame is. We have to be thinking much more long term, and I think anybody who goes out and starts an institution founded on good principles is really investing in their future, and I think we need a lot more of that too.
Roger, final words.
No, that was an interesting thought. Building institutions, I had not thought of us in that way, but he's not wrong, and it is an important thing. Final thoughts, I don't know, fall back on my usual, some sort of shocking thing. Neither the Lincoln nor the Jefferson memorials existed the last time the House was expanded, which, by the way, Dylan, earlier in the program, you mentioned 1918, which is not a date that's germane here. The number 435 was established in 1911.
28.
Yeah, 29 actually.
Okay.
But the 435 was established
Yeah.
after the 1910 census, and it was codified and frozen in 1929 by the Reapportionment Act.
That's right. Very good. Yeah, you are correct. I was just kind of talking off the top of my head.
And so when I say things like the Lincoln or Jefferson Memorial didn't exist, I mean they didn't exist in 1911. Although in this case it would be true for 1929 as well, I believe. But I say stuff like, the Titanic was still seaworthy, which was true in 1911, but it was not true in 1913. So
Yeah. So my final thought is, people struggle, I think, sometimes to understand how expanding the house will make us stronger. Think of it like if you're pouring concrete, okay, and you put what do they call those little bars you stick in the concrete? If you remember, help me out. With the name.
Rebar.
Rebar. I knew that.
rebar, reinforcement bars.
Right. You put you right. You reinforce it. Right. You're sticking more of them in there to make it stronger. That's what we need. We need more people in there. And to the point of what Dylan was making, the larger the group, the less the power the individual has. So if all the people that care about democracy, you really care about democracy, you should care about uncapping the House because it empowers your democratic vote. It makes it stronger. It makes it mean more. It increases your voice. And if you do care about that, you can go to our website, www.y435.org. You can sign up to volunteer. You can sign our declaration for representation to let your representative know that you're serious about uncapping the House. You can find a form email that you can copy and paste and send to your representative asking him or her to support uncapping the House by the 2030 census. And you can make a donation because, as I mentioned earlier, there was this guy, Mark Hanna, and he was really adamant that money played a big factor in politics. And when you're building an institution, you need to have money to build the institution. So visit www.y435.org and make your choice, make your voice heard. And the other thing you can do is you can find a community event. We've got 2 on the books now. Roger is putting one together. I'm working with 3 other volunteers right now, trying to get them to lead community events as well, hoping to have several by mid-year this year. And we really want to make uncapping the House a topic of discussion for the 2026 midterms. So sign up, keep with us. And as always, peace, love, and representation.
And representation. Ciao.
All right, so just hold still.